This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Elliott Abrams, who served as the 24th U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor. In this conversation, Elliott Abrams discusses his book, If You Will It, and the current state of American Jewry, particularly in light of the events of October 7th. They discuss themes of Jewish identity, the impact of anti-Semitism, the importance of Jewish education, and the role of Israel in shaping the future of American Jews. They also discuss the evolving political landscape in the U.S. and the Middle East, particularly in light of President Trump's anticipated return to office. They explore the implications for U.S. Israel relations, the shifting dynamics in Syria and Iran, and the potential for military action against Iran's nuclear program.
Elliott Abrams, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
We heard your intro at the outset of the podcast, but I do just need to say what an honor it is to have you here. Reagan aristocracy, former Assistant Secretary of State during the Reagan administration, on our Reaganism show. Done so much, of course, then and then in the years afterward. But today, we're excited to at least start the conversation by discussing your book, If You Will It, Rebuilding Jewish Peoplehood for the 21st Century. Amidst everything you do, you managed to also put out another book, and one that really caught my attention as an American Jew, observant Orthodox Jew. Naturally, I'm drawn to it. You chair Tikva, which is really having a great impact in my own life. My daughter is two daughters have participated in Tikva programming, but especially thinking about American Jews, which again is only just 2% plus, less than 3% of America's population, the impact of October 7th on American Jewry. In my mind, I think of it as kind of the October 8th in the United States of America and the rise of anti-Semitism. All that I thought made your book, If You Will It, so much more relevant and timely, unfortunately, in this case, due to a tragedy. But give us just a quick overview of what drew you to writing this book. First of its kind for you, I think, on the subject.
I actually wrote a book about the American Jewish community in 1997, published in 97, Faith or Fear.
Oh, right.
How Jews Can Survive in a Christian America. And that was based on the demographic data that had recently then been published about the American Jewish community, including an astonishing number that sent Jewish leaders across the country into horror. The intermarriage rate was 52% in the early 90s. There's more data now. There's particularly the very large Pew survey, Jewish Americans in 2020, which came out last year. And as I looked at the numbers, I thought, Pew is presenting them as a success story. Oh, the American Jewish community is growing. I thought it was not a success story. And I thought, particularly about 25 years after writing Faith or Fear, it would be useful to take another look and maybe my own views as to what is to be done would change. So I did that. I mean, I looked at not only Pew, but dozens of other surveys and books that had been written, and actually did come to a somewhat different view about the American Jewish community.
So tell us what that conclusion is, and maybe in doing that, you use the language of Jewish peoplehood here, which is kind of not the most common way to refer to American Jews and their connections to their community in the United States, and then, of course, more broadly into Israel.
In the previous book, Faith or Fear, what I said was, ethnicity is not going to keep American Jews Jewish. It's fading. The Holocaust memorials are not going to keep American Jews Jewish. One thing will, and that's Judaism, the practice of Judaism. I look at it again now, 25 years later, that is not wrong.
Right.
The thing is, it isn't happening. It isn't a practical approach to go to the maybe 90% of American Jews who are neither Orthodox nor, let's say, practicing conservative Jews, and say, hey, you should be more religious. It may be good advice, but it is not going to take. So the question that the conclusion that I came to here is, okay, what do you say to the 90% who are not, in a traditional sense, religious? And I think for many of them who still consider themselves very strongly to be Jews, the idea of nationhood or peoplehood is more compelling. And the question then was, well, for those who are not, again, traditionally observant, how do you convey that peoplehood from generation to generation? For 100 years ago, 75 years ago, World War II, you didn't have to worry about it. I mean, Jews lived in Jewish neighborhoods and lived in a kind of immersive Jewish experience.
You talk about your own experience, I think, with your parents' father selling the car.
Yes, yes.
Great anecdote to express that.
In a minute. And now it isn't automatic. Jews don't live in Jewish ghettos, Jewish neighborhoods. Jews live in America, in the suburbs. So how do you do it? Well, again, I'm really talking about the 90% who are not Orthodox or similarly observant. And I came up with three answers. The first is better Jewish education. We can go into that. The second is one that I think people think is nice but trivial, and it is not trivial. It's Jewish summer camping. And it's not trivial because, again, it's a completely immersive Jewish experience. For 4 weeks or 8 weeks, you're living as a Jew among Jews. And the third is time in Israel. We have 20 years of data about birthright, which is just 10 days, or as I sometimes put it, 10 lousy days, and it can be life-changing. So think about, okay, high school semester, gap year, college, junior year abroad in Israel. Not 10 days, but 100 days, 200 days, 300 or 400 days. That's going to have an enormous impact on the identity of an American Jewish kid.
I want to focus on the third one in just a minute, and that is a submersive experience in Israel. But first, explain why anti-Semitism alone isn't sufficient. I think you would have gone back, a century ago, certainly more than that, throughout Jewish history, elsewhere outside the United States, perhaps even within the United States. What would keep Jews immersed in their community and in their Jewish life would be really a result of anti-Semitism. You write, will American Jews now be saved by a wave of anti-Semitism that reminds us all of our Jewish identity and collective destiny? And you write, don't count on it. I mean, that seems right to me, but at the same time, you have to, as I was referencing at the outset of this conversation, October 8th, I think, has traumatized the Jewish community, I would think, even beyond the 10% that have strong Jewish identity, the 90% that you're talking about.
First, I think that anti-Semitism at a high enough level can have that impact. And it may in Europe, and it may in Australia, where you're beginning to see day after day after day significant anti-Semitic incidents where being identifiable as a Jew through your clothing or Magen David, a Jewish star around your neck.
Or your soccer jersey, in Amsterdam.
I mean, someone will try to kill you. That's really not happening in America. I don't think it's going to happen in America. I think, let's be candid about this. One of the reasons for it in Europe is the very large Muslim populations, which greatly outnumber the Jewish populations. That's not happening in America. But I give you another reason, in addition to, please God, the level of anti-Semitism not reaching that level in America. There's a very interesting study of American Jewish college kids in 2024, that is after October 7th. 2023. And what the study found is by Eitan Hirsch at Tufts. What he found was that your reaction to campus anti-Semitism, your reaction to, pro-Hamas rallies, tends to be based on what you came to campus with. Again, we're generalizing. These are statistics. But what he found was that students with what he called a high Jewish background reacted by deepening their sense of Jewish identity and activism. That's where the Jewish activists came from. High Jewish background doesn't mean that you're Orthodox necessarily. What it means is, does your family belong to a synagogue? Will you bar bat mitzvah? Have you ever been to Israel? I mean, the things you think of.
Right.
And for the students, the kids of low Jewish background, whose family and whose answer to that question was no, 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 they don't tend to react by deepening their sense of Jewish peoplehood and identification and going on pro-Israel rallies. As a generalization, they seem to react by pulling back.
So they're alienated.
Yes. I mean, it's just their feeling is that's, no, okay, it's bad. I mean, I wish people didn't do that, but it's not about me. I don't think that's shocking. Now, needless to say, there are going to be some Jewish kids of what Hirsch called low Jewish background who are going to get motivated by this kind of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel activity. And, great. I mean, if that's what it takes to restore their sense of identity, I'm sorry that it had to be that. But if it works, good. But Hirsch found it isn't working.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I'm somewhat surprised that it would be alienating for those that don't find their identity through the hate on campuses. But it's the data, and it's not, and it doesn't lie. So it is what it is. But I am curious to get you to integrate it. And here I'm going to draw a little bit from our recent Reagan National Defense Survey, which asked questions about U.S. policy towards Israel and got a sense of how Americans view Israel. What's so clear in our survey and other surveys have also revealed the same is that Israel's a divisive issue now, a politically divisive issue. Now, I will say this at the outset that even in our poll, when you ask people if you view Israel as somewhat of an ally or an ally, the number comes in like at 74% view Israel as somewhat of an ally or an ally. Japan, just as a frame of reference, comes in at 73%. Mm-hmm. The United Kingdom's at 85%. Mm-hmm. Ukraine outdoes Israel by 2% at 75%. But it just shows that Israel is in this category of good guy, ally, friend. So I'll say that kind of at the outset. But when it comes to the war in Gaza and whether or not the United States should continue to give military aid, it is such a divisive issue where I want to say that roughly 63% of Harris voters, right, which is a proxy for Democratic voters for the most part, want a ceasefire and oppose continue to give assistance, military assistance, Israel in any kind, offensive or defensive. And there's about a third in there, Elliott, that no matter what you're asking for, right, they're just opposed to. Those are just a couple of data points that demonstrate how progressive Democrats and democratic politics overall has really driven this, exposed this wedge on Israel. And I'm wondering how you integrate that, how you assimilate that data into your, assessment of American Jews, Jewish Americans, and Israel being a pathway towards kind of enhancing their peoplehood.
Well, there's a lot of bad data. And what you found, I think, is borne out by every other study. It's not anomalous. It's not a one-off. And it's particularly worrying is the generational factor. You can almost go by decade.
Yes.
65s, more than 50s, more than 40s. And the younger generation is not supportive. So let's talk about American Jews. To me, the answer to that is, in part, having people spend time in Israel. Young American Jews, there'll always be a few who are way out on the left, but I think the birthright numbers are pretty good. That is, sociologically, these are good studies over 20 years. And they suggest that time in Israel is very important. why would that be? Well, for one thing, you see with your own eyes. For another, particularly if you're there for 6 or 12 months, you're meeting your peers. You're meeting 18, 19, 20-year-old Israeli Jews. And you know what? They're not doing ultimate frisbee. They're fighting and dying for their country. And that experience is, I think, for many young American Jews, it's an extraordinary experience to see what their lives are like. So that is a good part of it. Another part of it, I think, the other two parts in my book, Jewish education, which is very striking. The American Jewish community, from a secular point of view, is one of the most accomplished communities in America or in the Jewish world anywhere, secular point of view. From a Jewish educational point of view, it's about the worst.
Right. It's a flip side.
In Jewish history, and compared to, say, Canadian Jews, British Jews, French Jews, Australian Jews, if you ask, for example, how many years of Jewish schooling does the child have? Does the child spend any time, 1 year, 5 years, elementary school, in a Jewish school? The answers are much worse in the United States than any of those other diaspora communities. By the way, one of the reasons is finance. That is, in all those other communities, people get some kind of tax break.
Yeah, some sort of subsidy.
Some kind of help from the state government, from the federal government. We're anomalous in the United States, and this may change. I mean, actually, it's beginning to change. And
red states in particular. And it kind of tracks with the broader education policy in this country, right?
Yes, you see more and more voucher programs. You see more and more parental choice. You see the Supreme Court weighing in from time to time to prevent prejudicial actions that exclude from programs religious schools. So all of that, I think, can help. But, the Israelis ought to be looking at the numbers that you just talked about.
Yeah.
And they ought to be worried about it. And I think, so what do they do about that worry? Well, there have been some pillars of support for Israel in the United States. One of them, the evangelical community. And young evangelicals also show this same pattern of diminished support for Israel.
You point that out, that support has diminished among that younger population. I am curious kind of how a Mike Huckabee, as President Trump's ambassador designate to Israel, obviously a leading voice in the evangelical community, might impact that. Or is he not speaking to the next generation of evangelicals?
That is a good question. I think there are a lot of evangelical leaders, and obviously I speak as a Jew, not an evangelical. I'm outside that community. But I think on the part of a lot of young evangelicals, there's been a kind of loss of confidence in that generation of leaders. But Israelis ought to be concerned about that, and they ought to be concerned about young American Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, they ought to be the ones talking to the American Jewish leadership, American Jewish philanthropists about getting more young American Jews to Israel.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. We're with Elliott Abrams, author of If You Will It, and a real expert in foreign policy, national security policy, senior roles in Republican administrations, from the Reagan administration to the George W. Bush administration. I want to just shift ever so slightly. And the Trump administration as well. You're right. Didn't mean to leave that one out. Want to shift ever so slightly to the issue that you were just picking up on, which is, the Israeli government's role here, and the state of Israel's role in terms of support for Israel, both broadly speaking in the United States and then amongst the American Jewish community, and as well as a younger population, younger demographic in each community. I remember a time working on Capitol Hill and it's not too long ago, this is, no more than 15 to 17 years ago, you'd have a vote as it relates to missile defense support for Israel, or certainly security assistance votes. And I mean, it got left to you with the feeling in the House of Representatives where I worked that I think the parliament in the world that was most pro-Israel didn't reside in Jerusalem. It resided in Washington, D.C. And here we are, 17 years later, and we were just talking about those numbers before. It's a wedge issue. It's a divide issue. I'll read you one more. There are 45% believe, that is from our poll, that Israel has a right to continue military action until it has removed the threats from Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. Okay, so like just 45% to continue. And then if you break it down, you're wondering, how do you not even get to 50%? 64% of Trump voters stand by that. Interesting that it's not higher, but 64%. But Harris voters, only 30%. Again, we're not talking about here whether the United States should give its munitions, which is a separate related question, right? And you can get into what the U.S. role should be. Even the Reagan administration kind of wrestled with this in terms of the Lebanon war when Menachem Begin was prime minister. Here the question is simply, does Israel have the right to continue their military operations? And it only yielded 30% of Harris voters. Question for you on that. Love your reaction overall, Elliott. But specifically, if policy changed, if it wasn't Bibi Netanyahu, right, but it was some other figure leading as prime minister in Israel, would those numbers move?
It moved a little, maybe 5%. But the fundamental problem wouldn't be solved. And the problem, look, the left around the world has turned against Israel. We were kind of late. That is, the American left turned against it. When we already saw that pattern, I just want to add one point on that, by the way. In reaction to that, Australian Jews, British Jews, French Jews, Canadian Jews moved right.
Yes.
They saw the left-wing parties were anti-Israel. They started voting for the Conservative Party.
France really stood out to me also, Le Pen.
Absolutely. Instead of the Labour Party, the so-called Liberal Party in Australia. Here, it's just beginning. There are disputes on what the vote was just now in November 5th for Trump, but it's clearly the vote is rising. It's rising very slowly.
Not as dramatic as the Hispanic population. Probably tracks what we're seeing with the black population, I would think,
Probably right. So it is a trend in the Democratic Party. There's just no question about it. And you're right. I mean, when I started work on the Hill when I was a very young guy, in 1975, I came down to work for Scoop Jackson. And Israel was a completely non-contentious issue.
Yep.
There were some Republicans who weren't very supportive.
Right.
This was beginning to turn. But in one way, I guess the point I'm making is it's not shocking that the American left should turn against Israel, because the left has turned against Israel everywhere. But
you go back, just real quick intervention, because you made me think of this. So, not scripted, but I think about your career, your storied career. So you had Scoop Jackson, but you also had Moynihan. Your time with Moynihan, and Moynihan, in some respect, was intellectual left, that neoconservative who countered an element of what we're seeing today that emerged when Jimmy Carter was president, particularly in the left's kind of role in the UN and Carter's appointee there. So we've seen some of this before, but I guess you're suggesting that that's not actually an appropriate parallel, because it was defeated. I guess my point.
It's interesting if you go back and think. Republican presidents have tended now more recently to be more and more pro-Israel, but Jimmy Carter had a very tough relationship with Israel. Barack Obama had a very tough relationship with Israel. Neither of them is now considered to have been a very pro-Israel president. You get to Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden, I buy the idea that in his guts, in his heart, he was pro-Israel, but his advice to Israel consistently was don't, stop. So if you're a Democrat, you're listening to the people you voted for. Bill Clinton, I think, is a very significant exception. But for the most part, now for two generations, Carter was elected in 76, it's 50 years. You've heard your leadership criticizing Israel and telling them not to do things they're doing. So it has an impact.
Yeah. I guess the where I was going with it, and it was Young, I believe, who was Carter's ambassador to UN and supported supported the Zionism as racism resolution in the UN. Right. I mean, it was just, to me, if you are pro-Israel and supporting a pro-Israel policy in the United States, you're advancing the security assistance package and you're vetoing in the UN Security Council resolution. And those are the top two. You don't get there, you can't say you're pro-Israel.
Yep.
Young, of course, and Carter administration violated that, but I guess you got to Clinton. It was corrected, right? In some respect. You mentioned Clinton was a notable exception. I guess my wonder is, in a different circumstance, did you anticipate you could, kind of have a future where the Democratic Party embraces a centrist Bill Clinton and then restores that support in the party for Israel?
It's certainly possible. I mean, what it would take would be precisely a leader like Clinton, that is, who said, here's why we lost. And Clinton was reacting against, for example, George McGovern and his defeats. Here's why we lost, and I'm going to pull this party back to the center. I think that's going to be very hard to do because the power of the left, politically, culturally, financially in the Democratic Party today is much greater than it was when Bill Clinton was running for president. I mean, that's a generation ago.
Yeah.
It's actually more than a generation. So I think, I hope it happens, but I think it would cause a gigantic split within the Democratic Party.
Let's talk about what we are looking forward to, which is President Trump returning to office here. We're recording just on December 12th, so just about under 40 days before Inauguration Day. And I am curious to look around the corner, Elliott, and anticipate what we might see out of the U.S. Israel relationship. And I'll just kind of give you a little bit of a few menu items that perhaps you can react to. Events right now in Syria. I mean, just dramatic change. Assad regime has fallen. He's in Moscow. Hezbollah is militarily weakened. The leadership is been destroyed. Hamas, of course, seems to now be open to concessions. Their leadership destroyed. And then Iran is weakened like we haven't seen. I mean, it's a dramatic change since October 7th to now on that front. We know that the Trump administration is going to absolutely reject what it's inheriting from the Biden administration as it relates to Iran policy. Maximum pressure will be restored. Obviously, you were involved in your time in the State Department, working for Secretary Pompeo on such matters. What do you think that looks like when we come in practically? What are the priorities, and how does it relate to what Israel's decision making?
With the caveat that Trump is always unpredictable.
Yes.
I think when you see people, first of all, like Rubio, Mike Waltz at the NSC, Mike Huckabee, as you said, in Israel, this will be a very pro-Israel foreign policy in general. What does that mean? I think it means, for one thing, no effort to hold back on military aid to pressure the government of Israel ever. I think it means an end to what I would call the bad advice that Israel has been getting from Joe Biden, particularly in the last year or so, on, stop, don't, pull back, don't do this, don't do that, restraint, take the win, the famous phrase. I think that's over as well. I think there's a very interesting question here about Iran.
Yes.
I think that Trump will go back to the maximum pressure policy, but people should remember it was not maximum pressure for regime change. In Trump's mind, it was maximum pressure to get a comprehensive negotiation. He was critical of the Obama deal, the JCPOA.
The JCPOA, yes.
Because why? It was time bound. It was not comprehensive.
Correct.
It did not deal with missiles. It did not deal with the proxies, the support for terrorism. He wanted a negotiation that would deal with all of that, or it wasn't worth having. Now, I think the chances of that are not good, because if you think of, what is the Iranian regime if it agrees, okay, no more nuclear weapons program, no more support for terrorists in the region? I mean, what's left? That's who they are.
Right.
Death to America, death to Israel. But I think that would be on his mind. And what worries me about it is the Iranians know that, and they will try to entrap him in a negotiation that goes nowhere, but kills, let's say, a year, when they can, in secret, be developing their nuclear weapons program further. I would just say one other thing about Trump, and I think the Iranians are going to find out, I think, very early, that he is not willing to put up with threats to Americans.
Yes.
He wasn't when it came to the American troops in Western Iraq and Eastern Syria. And I would bet that he's going to send them a message about the Houthis. And the message would be, if one of the missiles that you supplied the Houthis kills Americans, hits an American naval ship, we're going to attack you, not the proxy that you
We're
use.
holding you responsible. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I want to pull the thread on two items here, because I think you're right, and pick up on a really important nuance in terms of President Trump's penchant for negotiation and getting a good deal. And we're seeing that in Ukraine. We'll see it elsewhere. And I think you're right to say that's probably top of mind or his instincts as it relates to Iran.
Yeah.
But one of the key differences that you were hitting on before between a President Trump and a President Biden is what he will allow Israel to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of made me think, famously, Israel took out Iraq's nuclear program, Osirak operation, when President Reagan was in office, and it created some tension. The F-16s, you may recall, were held up as a kind of slight slap on the wrist. Well, I'm sure scholars would debate whether it was intended to be more than a slap on the wrist or not. But my point I'm trying to convey is that was a moment where you had a very pro-Israel president coming off of as you outlined, a president who was not supportive of Israel. Israel thought, from an existential standpoint, they needed to act to deal with the nuclear weapons program. That was Iraq, and they acted. Here we are. Israel sees Iran as vulnerable. They've exposed their vulnerability, and they're responsible for the vulnerability, certainly militarily speaking, with respect to the defeat of their air defense systems.
Yes.
Come post-January 20th, if Israel were to decide to act, and there's reason to argue they could, given that now there seems to be consensus, Tehran is weeks away, right? You can count it in days, not in months, from realizing this nuclear weapon. How would a President Trump in that moment react? I mean, that's what I'd love to get your thinking on.
A couple of things about that. In the Reagan administration, I was working at time of Osirak for Al Haig, Secretary of State Haig.
Yep.
And I do remember, his reaction was, we have to condemn it in the UN Security Council. Boy, wasn't it terrific? It was really great. I mean, there was a mixed reaction.
Yeah, and Haig was famously very supportive of Israel. Deeply, even when it got difficult for the president with Lebanon and the like. Yes.
Now, then fast forward to George W. Bush, when the Israelis taking out the Syrian nuclear reactor. And there, Bush was quite supportive. I mean, officially, the position was, you do what you need to do.
Right.
We are not going to do it, he decided. But when then Prime Minister Olmert said, well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it, Bush said, you do what you need to do, and issued instructions to Steve Hadley, National Security Advisor, and to me, no one is to do anything whatsoever that would get in their way, make it more difficult. And of course, they then, a couple of months after that, they did it. I cannot see Donald Trump trying to prevent this. That is, if Netanyahu comes to him and says, they're weeks away from having the sufficient amount of enriched uranium, we know that they are moving forward toward the warhead. This is the moment to do this, and we're going to do it. I can see Donald Trump saying, do what you need to do. I cannot see him saying, no, don't do it. Hold off. Trump remembers, Trump went through this when he decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem.
Yes, this is a great example.
He was told by lots of so-called experts, including Secretary of State Tillerson, at the end of the world, I mean, there's going to be global violence and there'll be mass rioting and American embassies will be overrun. And Trump was not deterred. He did it. He did not listen to that bad advice. And I think in a case like this, too, if the Israelis say, we need to do this, this is really existential. People throw the word around. This is a matter of our existence. I cannot see Donald Trump saying no.
Yeah, that's well argued. You're right to reference the George W. Bush administration's case with the North Korean supplied reactor in Syria. It just seems to me, for the first time in a generation, really, Israel is best positioned come January 20th, 2025, to take military action against Iran's nuclear weapons program. The conditions politically and militarily, is what we know from, I'm only privy to unclassified information, seem to be the best they've been. Right. As a result, and Iran has invited it almost with their very brazen, very brazen attacks on Israel, and kind of allowed for these conditions to be shaped.
That is something new. Prior to the last year, Israel had never attacked Iran. Iran had never attacked Israel. So that's a new condition. There will be counter arguments. I mean, I think President Trump will hear from particularly the Emiratis and the Saudis, who are afraid that if Israel strikes Iran, Iran knows now that it can't do much damage to Israel, so it will hit them just out of anger, and it will accuse them of being
complicit. Yeah,
and they're right to worry. There's no question about that. Also, there's an operational question here. How much of that nuclear program can Israel damage or destroy? I don't know the answer to that question. And if you ask, Israelis who know, they're obviously not going to talk about it. But I agree with you. The stars are much more aligned now than they have ever been. And look at the map.
Yes.
Not only has Israel taken out some of those SA-3 air defense batteries in Iran, why is Israel knocking out all the air defense batteries in Syria?
Well, I'm glad you're going there. That's what I want to go to next. It's creating that beltway. Yeah.
They're clearing a path to fly that flight.
Yeah, and it was clear that the instability in Syria is what allowed them to carry out the initial strikes as well. And we do see stories in the paper today how Israel's doing something significant and meaningful when the UN envoy is coming in and telling Israel to stand down. Don't take out the security architecture and military assets of the fallen Assad regime, lest you create instability. I mean, it's just kind of like, what are you talking about? You couldn't have a more unstable environment, and this is at least would be 101 in terms of Israel ensuring that whoever comes in and rules Syria will not pose a threat and use those assets against Israel.
To Jordan either.
And great point. And to Jordan. With our remaining time here, before we get to our lightning round, I do want to draw you out, Elliott. What a wonderful conversation. Really great to have you here, an honor to have you here, is to talk a little bit about the hostage crisis. We are sitting here, as we just mentioned a moment ago, less than 40 days away from Inauguration Day. There seems to be movement ever since President Trump's tweet, they'll be hell to pay if the American hostages aren't released. One, I think, of great failures of the Biden administration was not sufficiently publicly prioritizing. Yeah. I'm not talking about what's happening behind closed doors. The plight of the American hostages, three are believed to be alive. Others, including Hirsch, Goldberg, Poland, murdered while in captivity, not just those murdered on October 7th. I'm talking about American citizens. As you look at this, and you know the players and the actors, you've been the lead in the U.S. government on in the region, written books on it. Do you see a moment here, an opportunity here, that before Inauguration Day we might see the U.S. hostages and all the hostages be released, be freed?
I do. Things have changed on the ground for Hamas, that's clear. And I think the fall of Assad adds to this because Hamas sees what Hezbollah and Iran did for Assad? Nothing. Nothing.
Yes.
So they know they're on their own, and they know the Israelis are going to continue to grind them down. They know that Donald Trump is coming in, and he is not going to say to the Israelis, stop, get out of Gaza. He wants to see it stopped, of course, as we all do, with the hostages out. So, the terms of the deal are a different question. How many people get out on day one? How many people get out on day two? Does Hamas have control of all of the hostages? What about PFLP or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or criminal gangs? This needs to be ironed out. And we do have an extremely capable hostage negotiator, Roger Carstens,
yes,
who's still in the job and, in fact, has been in the region, not only for Gaza, but for also Tice in Syria. Yeah. It looks as if there really is movement. And the Trump tweet, I think you're right, helped. And I think the sense on the part of the Qataris that things may get tougher for them if they don't do more. So I'm really hopeful now that at least a good number of hostages get out and that a process is started that leads to the rest getting out after January 20th.
Last question, then we'll go to our lightning round. Events, as we've discussed, in Syria most recently, we were talking about what Israel has done in response to Iranian aggression to Iran and their strength, Israel's operations against Hezbollah, and then, of course, in Gaza and against Hamas. Some have called this the fall of the Berlin Wall moment for the Middle East. I think it's probably a bad idea generally to spike the football in anything when it comes to Middle East. But it does suggest that there is a paradigm shift that's going on here that's creating new opportunities. We talked about it as it relates to the Iranian nuclear program. We were just talking about as it relates to hostages. How significant, Elliott, are these developments? Here we are, year plus since October 7th. Certainly Israel's in a stronger position, and Iran's proxies are in a weakened position.
It's extremely significant. I mean, for the reason just stated, that is, Iran seemed to have an unbeatable policy of creating these proxies, which then attacked Israel and attacked the United States, which controlled large parts of Iraq, which controlled basically all of Lebanon. And no one knew what to do about it. No one had a solution to it. And it's blown up. It's gone. It was, I would say, if 1 year ago you would have said, we've had the most successful foreign policy in the last 10 years, the most successful foreign policy in many ways, Iran.
I agree with that.
And it is not true, as we
overplayed
here today. It's just been blown up. By the way, how has it been blown up? By force. So, you hear all these lectures about how everything has to be solved diplomatically. Force is not the answer. Well, it was the answer here. But I wouldn't call it the fall of the Berlin Wall moment. Maybe it's kind of like the solidarity moment in Poland. It's the fall of the Berlin Wall moment, I would say, is when the Iranian regime starts to collapse. That's really when the Middle East will change even more fundamentally. One hopes that this is the beginning. And boy, if I were in the Iranian regime, I think I would worry a lot, because we've just seen how brittle an apparently solid dictatorship can be.
Great set of points. Elliott Abrams, we'll go to our lightning round. What a wonderful discussion. Here's where we ask all our guests to give their favorite Reagan, share with us their favorite Reagan book, speech, quote. You can give us all three, two, or just one. What do you have to share?
Well, for the book, there was a book that came out probably about a year ago called The Peacemaker.
Yes.
By Will Inboden, now at the University of Florida. And it's a study of Reagan's foreign policy, and it's chronological. Most of the books, I would say all of the other books, go, well, here's Europe, and here's Russia, and now let's talk about China. Will goes chronologically, and that lets you see what Reagan was confronting day by day, week by week, year by year, because they all happened at the same time. He didn't get to deal with them discreetly. So you see the policy as he confronts crises and as it is rolled out. And it was a novel and I think really deeply insightful view of Reagan and of the Reagan administration.
Yeah, a masterful book. I couldn't agree more. That his approach, as you outlined, is just, you really learned so much from it.
Favorite speech? The speech to British Parliament, Westminster speech.
Oh, I thought you were going to go there, Elliott. The Westminster speech. There we go.
Sure.
Wait, the great advocate for freedom. No doubt you went to probably Reagan's finest speech on the subject.
It was, and it really, for anybody who's listening, it bears rereading, where he talks about America and England, for that matter, the cause of democracy and why it is important for the United States. It's not, it's not a sort of luxury. It is what we are about. Favorite saying?
Yeah, what quote do you have, huh?
Yeah, come on. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down. I say that for two reasons. One, because it was so important historically, but two, because advisor after advisor after advisor said, it has to come out, you can't say that. And this was pure Reagan saying, no, I'm president and I'm going to say it. There are a few other stories that you can't tell in a G-rated podcast, but Reagan had a great sense of humor and a million Hollywood stories. I'll tell you that one next time we meet.
We look forward to that when we go to the PG-13 podcast mode. Elliott Abrams, congrats on your book, if you will, excuse me, and thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure, Roger. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.